Hey Brian, before I get started, I want to tell you how much I enjoy your shows. That Bigfoot podcast has become my new favorite. It's my guilty pleasure. I love the no BS approach and the banter between you and Wayne. You guys do a great job. It's for that reason I've decided to come to you with this. I've recently heard you guys talking about a subject that got my attention. You guys covered a story about a woman giving birth to Bigfoot's baby. I first thought about reaching out to the show that first shared that story, but not knowing the show the way that I know yours, I decided to contact you with it. I hope you can understand and respect how difficult this is for me to talk about, and accept the fact that I must insist on remaining anonymous. This is my grandmother's story, and I'm one of the few people in the world that she ever told about it. It all started when she was a young girl. Her family lived in Arkansas on a 200-acre farm. Her father, which would make him my great-grandfather, had some grain silos on the property. I'm not a farmer, so I couldn't tell you how they worked or what all they did other than hold grain. He noticed that he had some new fresh dents on a couple of them, and he couldn't figure out where they were coming from. This all started very suddenly, and he could not figure out for the life of him what was going on, until one day, my grandmother said she heard a commotion coming from around the silos early one morning. It was just past dawn and the sun wasn't fully out yet. She knew that my granddad had already been up for a while tending to the animals, so she ran outside right in time to see this thing that was a little bit smaller than she was, running off into the woods with her father giving chase. This thing appeared to be covered in black hair, with patches of brown all over it. She said she'd never seen anything run so fast. She asked her father about it and asked him what happened. She said she would never forget what he told her. He said, "I think that was a little booger. The damn thing fell in my silo. I thought it was some kids messing around and climbing on it, so I yelled at him to get off, and I reckon I startled him because he fell through the damn roof. I ran over to open the hatch, hoping it wasn't full yet. When I opened the hatch, the hairy bastard shot out of there and took off running and hollering. He scared the shit out of me. Turns out the silo wasn't anywhere near full, but there was definitely grain in there. That's why he appeared to have these brown spots on him. It was the grain that he fell into. In reality, this thing was jet black. It was covered from head to toe in thick black hair. Grandma said she had no idea what to make of it. She knew her daddy to be a hard-working, honest man that would never lie, not to mention her seeing it for herself. They were the only two to see what happened that morning, and she was told not to speak a word of it to anyone, so she decided that she wouldn't. Now, the way I was told that her daddy figured it, this thing must have felt like he saved its life or something of the sort, because this thing started showing up from time to time, watching her daddy work around the farm. She said the first few times he noticed it, it would run off from him. But it never stayed gone long, though. It would always come back the next day and sometimes that same day. Her daddy just started to accept it. He said it never did bother him or anything else. That's until one day her daddy noticed a chicken or two had gone missing. This really pissed him off at first, and he did something that shocked her. The next time he saw this thing, he stopped what he was doing, walked over to the chicken coop, grabbed up one of the chickens, and started walking towards the booger. Grandma said she wouldn't have believed it had she not seen it with her own eyes. She said he walked over towards this thing, swinging the chicken around in circles and yelling, "No, no, my chicken, leave my chickens alone." She said she laughed so hard at the sight of her daddy yelling at this thing she almost peed her pants. I can still hear how hard she was laughing every time she told me that story. Her daddy was able to get pretty close to this thing, and when he did, that's when he noticed how skinny this thing looked. He said it seemed to have this scared or sad look on its face as well. This made her daddy feel terrible because this thing was clearly just hungry. He speculated later on in life that its family must have abandoned him once he took interest in and started showing himself to humans. He always said he couldn't prove it, but that's what he always felt. This is when her daddy started leaving food out for it. When this began, it was the beginning of what my grandma called the greatest love of her life. Her love for a Sasquatch named Koda. As the years went by, Kota became a permanent fixture to our family. Grandma was an only child, and her mother, my great-grandmother, was the only other person on the farm aside from my great-grandpa. Of course, they had family and friends that would visit from time to time, so their guard always had to stay up at all times. I mean, how exactly would you explain this to others? How do you explain the almost 8-foot-tall, hair-covered farmhand that always followed them around all the time? It's also important to remember that my grandma first saw Koda when they were both very young. Grandma was actually a bit taller than Koda when she first saw him, but that didn't last for very long. She said Koda started growing like a weed. They grew up together, is what it boils down to. And during those very impressionable years, the puberty years, they managed to get even closer. Grandma says she fought it as much as she could, but the feelings just became too strong. Something else you'll need to know about my grandma is that she had a cousin. We'll call her S. S was born deaf, and in those years it was much harder on people with disabilities. S came from a loving family, and they were very well off financially compared to most back then. They did their best to make her life as comfortable as possible, including sparing no expense on education. Everyone, including my grandma, learned sign language so they could talk to S. This ended up coming in handy later on, as it became the only way Grandma and Kota could communicate. That's right, Kota was able to learn a bit of sign language. To hear my grandma tell it, all he knew was a few simple and basic signs, but it opened up all kinds of doors for the two of them, and only helped to bring them closer. Now don't get me wrong, this was not a relationship that was accepted by my grandma's parents. They fought it with all they could. They told her many times that if they had the money, they would send her off to boarding school. There was this one time they were caught alone in the barn, and Grandma's daddy stormed into the house and came out with his rifle, screaming, "We aren't going to have to worry about sending you off. I'm about to send his hairy ass off." Luckily, Kota had time to get away and into the woods. Grandpa never really viewed Kota the same way after that, and he definitely looked at his little girl differently. As if this story wasn't hard enough to believe, it gets even more crazy. It was summertime, right before my grandma's 17th birthday, when she realized it had been over a month since she'd had her last period. She said that she'd never really been very regular to begin with, so it wasn't something that concerned her right away. But when she began to get sick every single morning, she began to worry. She said that it was not just sick, but violently sick. She described it as the most violent vomiting anyone could ever imagine. Had it been a normal morning sickness, maybe she could have hidden it from her parents for a while longer. But every single episode of sickness was so severe, it was impossible for anyone in the house not to hear it. Eventually, her parents took her to the doctor, only to get confirmation of what she had already been thinking. She was pregnant. Around 3 months, the doctor estimated. Her heart sank, and her father's eyes raged with fury. He hoped with all that he had that there was some boy in town that he wasn't aware of. Imagine that, hoping your teenage daughter was pregnant by some man you didn't know, because the alternative was half Booger for a grandchild. That wasn't to be the case, though. Kota was the father. My grandmother said she had no idea how it was even possible. Kota wasn't even human, right? How could this be? For months, they discussed what to do. Kota came around less and less at the request of my grandma. She couldn't guarantee that her father wouldn't blow his brains out given the first opportunity. Over time, though, she wore her daddy down. After all, Grandma had always been the apple of her father's eye. He had been wrapped around her tiny finger since the day she was born. There was nothing he wouldn't forgive her of, and eventually he accepted it, and they devised a plan. As much as he hated it, his baby girl would soon be a mother, and they had absolutely no idea to what. What was this child going to look like? It mattered not, because this was going to be their grandchild, and they would love it and help protect it in any way they could. To hear it told, my great-grandfather wasn't just a farmer. He was quite the good carpenter as well, and in no time he had built a small rustic cabin in the woods behind their farmhouse. It wasn't anything spectacular, but it was where his grandchild would live and be raised. He had cleared out a spot a couple of 100 yards in the woods behind the house and a few miles away from anyone else. They would all have to learn as they went because this was new to everyone. Grandma told me that this was the hardest 8 months of her life. She lived in constant discomfort and pain, not to mention the nausea that seemed to get worse as the pregnancy went on instead of better. I know the normal length of a pregnancy is almost 10 months, but she barely made it to 8. She believed that this was due to the size of her baby. It was much larger than the average newborn. The delivery of the child took much longer than anyone expected. Grandma was in labor for over 24 hours. It was the single worst and most painful experience of her life. She delivered in that little cabin with only her mother and father there. They were too afraid to have any doctors present. No doctors meant that there had to be no complications. Around hour 26, she was able to push him out. I wish this could be a happy ending to a crazy story, but that's not to be the case. The baby was stillborn. Grandma was devastated. She had no idea what its life may have been like, but it was her child, and she loved him just the same. She would never talk much about what he looked like, other than having a lot more hair than any baby should. She did say that he weighed 15 pounds, but basically, he looked like a large, hairy newborn baby. It was the following day when Kota came around. She said, not only are Bigfoot real, but they have emotions and the ability to cry. Kota let out a terrible scream, and tears started to flow down his cheeks. He held his dead son in his arms and walked him into the woods. Grandma, with the help of her mother and father, followed him. They were all devastated and unable to control their emotions. They watched as Kota placed the baby in Grandma's arms, and he picked up a rock that an average man would have had a hard time lifting, and he smashed it over another larger rock, breaking it into smaller pieces. He took one of those smaller pieces with a sharp end, and he began to dig a hole. She said the hole was about 3 foot by 3 foot and 4 feet deep as Kota could reach with his arm anyway. He then placed the baby in the hole and covered it up with the remaining dirt. Kota then found a much larger rock, bigger than the one he had already broken, and placed it on the grave. He and my grandma just stood there, holding each other for several minutes. Kota then kissed her on the head and walked into the woods. My grandma said she didn't know how she knew it, but she knew that was going to be the last time she would ever see him. And it was. It took some time, but she eventually healed from the birth, but she never really healed from the loss of Kota and the baby they shared. She went on to meet and fall in love with my grandpa. They were married and had 3 children of their own, but she never told him about her first love and the child that they had had. My grandpa died not long after I was born, so I never got to know him, but everyone says that he was a great man. Now you have to keep in mind that this, of course, is a secondhand story. It did not happen to me, and I only know what I was told, so if there are any details that are off, it's not on purpose. I did my best in the retelling. Take this story however you want, but it was very difficult for me to write this. I struggled with if I should, because I know most sane people will not believe this. But I have never known of my grandma to lie. She was your typical sweet old grandmother, and I believe every word that she told me. It's up to you and your listeners to decide if you do. Thank you again for allowing me and others to share their experiences, and I wish you and Wayne the best and continued success.